There we go. So as I was just saying, throughout February, we have talked about history. Probably the first thematic month that I've ever prepared for these sermons, these services. Specifically, we've been focusing on elements of Black history as we recognized Black History Month. I think this is the close of February, and with this talk, I hope we'll reveal how history, maybe a new look at history, can be the fuel for powering what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King called the urgency of now. When Reverend King spoke at the March on Washington in 1963, he described a fierce urgency of now. He reminded a then divided nation that we need one another and that we are stronger when we march forward together. He said, "We cannot walk alone, and as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall march ahead. We cannot turn back." Our march forward is informed by history. It is part of that prophetic equation that we talk regularly here on Sundays about, history is part of the world as it is. It compels us to look forward to the world as it should be, and we are energized to walk forward together, not turning back, but we are energized to act, oftentimes in response to what history has taught us. Today I want to use the work of Bryan Stevenson, I mentioned him earlier, and the organization that he founded, the Equal Justice Initiative, to represent our potential march forward, starting with a new sense of history. Stevenson, many of you will know, is currently quite well known because of the book and the film of the same name, Just Mercy, that describes his personal story as a public interest attorney who has been providing legal representation to people who have been illegally convicted, unfairly sentenced, or abused in state jails or prisons. He notably challenges the death penalty in several states and other instances of excessive judgment. EJI, and again, that's the Equal Justice Initiative, the organization Stevenson founded in 1989, on top of all that legal work, has also undertaken an exhaustive review of our country's legacy of terror lynchings. Their report, Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror, was published in 2017. And I'll use much of the report's language in the next few minutes of this talk, and I just want to give credit where credit's due there. So during the period between the Civil War and World War II, thousands of African Americans were lynched in the United States. Lynchings were violent and public acts of torture that traumatized Black people throughout the country and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. These lynchings were terrorism. Terror lynchings peaked between 1880 and 1940 and claimed the lives of nearly 4,400 African American men, women, and children, and impacted the lives of all African Americans who were forced to endure the fear and humiliation while the barbarity of this widespread practice went unchecked. EJI researchers have documented several hundred more lynchings than the number previously identified. Their investigation revealed up to 1,000 more lynchings than had been reported prior. Racial terror lynchings were much more prevalent than previously reported. Nearly 4,400 documented terror and lynchings. That number shapes a new look at history. EGI declares that lynching profoundly impacted race relations in this country and shaped the geographic, political, social, and economic conditions of African Americans in ways that are still evident today. Terror lynchings fueled the mass migration of millions of Black people from the South to urban ghettos in the North and West throughout the first half of the 20th century, the report shares. Lynching created a fearful environment where racial subordination and segregation was maintained with limited resistance for decades. Most critically, lynching reinforced a legacy of racial inequality that has never been adequately addressed in America. The administration of criminal justice in particular is tangled with the history of lynching in profound and important ways that continue to contaminate the integrity and fairness of the justice system. And I would ask you who were here on our celebration of Martin Luther King Day, Jessica and I spoke about that current day challenge as well. But there it is. That's the world as it is. A new look at the historical magnitude of impact of terror lynching and its legacy of racial inequality that has never been adequately addressed in America. That's the world as it is. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that our nation must fully address our history of racial terror and the legacy of racial inequality it has created. Their report explores the power of truth and reconciliation to address oppressive histories by urging communities to honestly and soberly recognize the pain of the past. There is an urgent need to challenge the absence of recognition in the public space on the subject of lynching. I'm going to share with you a quick video from EJI that has that talks about the genesis of their creation of the Legacy Museum and the National Museum for Peace and Justice. Both are located in Montgomery, Alabama, and they form a place that EJI says concretizes our experience of this legacy through discourse, monuments, and other acts of reconciliation that will help us overcome the shadows cast by these grievous events. That was Brian Stevenson as the narrator and the main person in that video. And close to the end of the video, he talked about the legislative outcomes of the civil rights efforts in the 60s, and he stated, "We changed some laws, but we refused to talk about what had happened. And because we didn't talk about it, we created this dynamic in America where there's all this tension, all this conflict, all this division, and the legacy continues to haunt us." And then he finished the video later by saying, "We're not going to be able to reconcile ourselves to that history until we deal more honestly with what that history has done to all of us." History has revealed the urgency of now. Or maybe it's repeated that fierce urgency of now that Reverend Dr. King recognized when he said, "We can't walk alone." Brian Stevenson invokes the truth and reconciliation efforts in Rwanda, South Africa, and Germany. He makes it clear that we have not yet made those truth and reconciliation efforts in the United States. Again, he called for us to deal more honestly with what history has done to all of us. We can't walk alone. What history has done to all of us. Truth and reconciliation, be it with African Americans or Native Americans or others, seems to carry with it an urgency of now. We can't wait any longer. Recently, I participated in the first day of a 2-day training, along with a few others in this congregation, that was presented here in Houghton that was focused on building the beloved community. On that first night of the training, the presenters were focused on the traumatic experiences of Native American children at Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. We watched a movie that some of you might be familiar with called Dawnland. It's a documentary that focuses on the systematic separation of Wabanaki children from their families by government agents. This practice of family separation went on up until the 1970s. Many of these children suffered devastating emotional and physical trauma after being separated from their families. And a major part of this film was focused on Maine state government-sanctioned Truth and Reconciliation Commission on these Native American affairs. They gathered testimony in that commission from Wabanaki families who were affected by this practice. So as that movie was playing, and throughout the night, on the side of the screen, standing on an easel, there was a sign that was displayed. It was a two-part sign. And the first part, the top of the sign, read, "Native peoples want to share the truth." Something like that. The bottom part of the sign read, "White people want reconciliation." The film showed the difficulty with what was the effort at reconciliation in Maine. Conversations broke down. The Native American participants are shown meeting in one room, while the white folks have gathered in another room. No resolution was found. The leader of that night's training explained to us that the experience in Maine has informed the moving forward truth and reconciliation effort in Michigan, and they have determined to leave reconciliation off the title and refer to it only as a truth commission. I admit I was dismayed by that report. I was dismayed by the sign that stood impassively in the front of the room throughout that and just stated that as if it was unchanging, even though I felt we were in a dynamic situation. I believe reconciliation is hard to develop. As Stevenson said earlier in the chalice lighting, you can't force people into truth and reconciliation, and I think that's what the movie and the decision to create only the Truth Commission in Michigan are really saying. Reconciliation is going to be hard. But Stevenson also tells another story, a simple human story that I think helps end this conversation, this sermon, and helps us start working towards our reconciliation effort. And some of you have heard this story, but I will tell it again. As part of the Legacy Museum, people have visited lynching sites and filled glass bottles with dirt from those sites. They returned the filled bottles to the Legacy Museum, where the name of the person is attached to the front of the bottle. The name of the person who was murdered at that site is placed on the front of the bottle, and that bottle is then placed on a shelf alongside hundreds of other bottles. The dirt, its presence on the shelf, its symbolic presence at the lynching, the heft of those filled bottles representing the weight of the truth we need to feel, see, and understand. Stevenson tells the story of a woman who took on the job of visiting a site and filling a bottle. She knelt on the ground with her garden trowel, filling the bottle, and as she was doing that, a pickup truck rumbled up next to her and stopped. The woman and a man got out of that truck, and he was described by the woman in the story as a large white man, and he walked toward her. The woman, who was black, was apprehensive as he approached. He asked her, "What are you doing?" The woman told him the story of the Legacy Museum and the fact that a person had been lynched on this site, and she went on. And later she told the museum staff that she was actually surprised at how she just kept telling the story to the stranger. The man asked if the paper that she had next to her told the story of the person who had been lynched. She said yes, and gave it to him. He read it, and after he read it, he kneeled down beside her and asked if he could help fill the jar. She said yes, and as they worked together, she began to cry. And the man said, "Oh, I'm sorry I've upset you." She replied that he hadn't upset her. She was just so moved by him being there. A couple minutes later, the woman realized the man had tears coming down his cheeks. And she asked, why was he crying? And he said, "I'm just now realizing that my grandparents could have been part of the lynching." There is a fierce urgency of now for truth of reconciliation around slavery, segregation, terror lynching, and their legacy. Let's not avoid the conversation any longer. I see over 900 UU congregations across the country, and I hope that Unitarian Universalists recognize the power of simply kneeling together and recognizing the damage done, and then standing up and walking forward together, because we can't walk forward alone.